The echo of my pickaxe against stone has become the rhythm of my heartbeat, a sound that will follow me into whatever darkness awaits beyond these molten tunnels. My name was Thorek Ironpick, and I have spent 43 years mining the depths of Blackrock Mountain since the day Thaurissan's folly tore our world asunder and summoned the Firelord from his elemental realm. In those moments of brief rest between shifts, when the overseers retreat to commune with their master, I remember what it felt like to breathe air that did not taste of sulfur and ash. I remember when the mountain was not our prison, but simply stone waiting to yield its treasures to patient hands. I had been working the silver veins in the Red Ridge Mountains for nearly 2 decades when the world ended. Those were good years, honest years, when the rhythm of my pickaxe spoke of purpose rather than servitude. The mines ran deep through granite and limestone, following seams of precious metal that glittered like stars in the lamplight. My father had worked these same tunnels before me, and his father before him, each generation of ironpicks adding their knowledge to the ancient craft of coaxing wealth from stone. The Dark Iron clan had always prided themselves on their skill with pick and hammer, their ability to find the richest veins where others saw only barren rock. We were the deepest delvers, the most patient miners, willing to spend months following a promising seam through twisting passages that would challenge even the most experienced tunnel rats. Our city of Thaurissan, nestled in a valley surrounded by these productive mines, its forges always burning bright with the wealth we drew from the earth's bones. I remember the weight of my father's pickaxe in my hands when he passed it down to me, the handle worn smooth by generations of faithful service. It had been forged by the greatest smiths of our clan, its head inscribed with runes that were said to guide the wielder to the richest ore. Whether that was true or merely tradition, I cannot say, but I never swung that pickaxe without feeling the presence of all those who had carried it before me. The other miners knew me as a steady worker, one who could be trusted to maintain his section of tunnel without constant supervision. I took pride in the precision of my cuts, the way I could read the stone and anticipate where it would split most cleanly. There was an art to proper mining, a dance between hammer and stone that required patience, skill, and an understanding of the earth's moods that could not be taught, only learned through decades of practice. My wife, Mira, would pack my lunch each morning before I descended into the depths, usually bread thick with honey and strips of salted pork that would sustain me through the long shifts. She worried about cave-ins and gas pockets, the everyday dangers that claimed a few miners each year. But neither of us imagined that greater horrors were stirring in the political chambers far above our simple concerns. The troubles began with whispers in the taverns, rumors of defeat and exile that filtered down from the halls where clan leaders made their decisions. The War of Three Hammers had ended badly for our people, with the Bronzebeard clan claiming dominance over all dwarven lands and casting both Wildhammer and Dark Iron into exile. I understood little of politics then, caring more for the honest work of my hands than the schemes of kings and generals. King Thaurissan had led us to these mountains after our banishment from Ironforge, promising that we would build a new kingdom to rival anything the Bronzebeards had achieved. The mines were rich, the defensive positions strong, and for a time it seemed his vision might prove true. We carved great halls from the living rock, established trade routes with human settlements, and began the slow work of turning exile into opportunity. But exile burned in our king's heart like an unquenchable flame. The defeat at Ironforge had wounded his pride beyond healing, and that wound festered with each passing year. He could not accept that the Dark Iron clan, with all their skill and ancient pride, should live in reduced circumstances while lesser dwarves ruled from the halls of his fathers. The attacks came without warning, sudden strikes against both Ironforge and Grim Batul that caught our enemies unprepared. For a brief moment, it seemed the king's gamble might succeed. The reports that reached us in the mines spoke of victories, of Bronzebeard and Wildhammer forces reeling before our assault. Thaurissan himself led the attack on Ironforge, while his queen, the sorceress Modgood, took her army against the Wildhammer stronghold. I was deep in the mines when word came that Queen Modgood had fallen at grim battle, her death curse poisoning that ancient fortress until none could dwell there safely. The other miners gathered around the messenger, their faces grim in the lamplight as they absorbed the implications. Without the Queen's sorcery, our forces would be outnumbered and outmatched when the inevitable counterattack came. The combined armies of our enemies were already marching toward Thaurissan, their banners visible from our highest watchtowers. King Thaurissan called for every able-bodied dwarf to prepare for siege, but even as we sharpened weapons and stockpiled provisions, we knew the mathematics of war were against us. The Bronzebeard and Wildhammer clans together commanded forces that dwarfed our own, and their rage at our surprise attacks would make them implacable in their pursuit of vengeance. It was then that the king made his fateful decision. Rather than face defeat and probable execution, he would attempt a summoning that would tip the balance of power decisively in our favor. The court sorcerers had discovered references to ancient entities that slumbered beneath the world, beings of such power that even a small portion of their might would be sufficient to crush our enemies. The risks were acknowledged, but deemed acceptable compared to certain destruction. I was in the deepest part of the mine when the summoning began, following a silver vein that showed promise of connecting to a larger deposit. The tunnel was narrow and humid, barely wide enough for a single dwarf to work comfortably, but the ore samples I had extracted suggested the effort would be worthwhile. I was alone down there, the nearest miners working shafts several hundred feet away, when the mountain began to scream. The sound started as a vibration in the rock itself, a thrumming that I felt in my bones before my ears recognized it as noise. My pickaxe, raised for another strike against the stone face, froze in my hands as the tunnel walls began to shiver. Dust rained from the ceiling, and somewhere far above, I heard the deep groan of stressed stone approaching its breaking point. At first, I thought it was a cave-in, the kind of catastrophic collapse that occasionally claimed entire sections of a mine when too much material had been extracted too quickly. I had experienced smaller collapses before, the terrifying moment when the Earth's patience with our excavations finally ended, and it reclaimed the spaces we had hollowed out. But this was different, larger, a convulsion that seemed to affect the entire mountain rather than just one unstable area. The temperature began to rise. At first it was subtle, just enough to make me notice that my usual layers of clothing felt too warm for the conditions. Then it became obvious, an oppressive heat that had no place in the deep mines where the Earth's natural coolness should have provided relief from surface temperatures. The air itself began to taste different, taking on a metallic tang that reminded me of the smell that preceded thunderstorms. I abandoned my work and began making my way toward the surface, following tunnel markers that had been carved into the walls by generations of miners. The heat continued to intensify with each step, and by the time I reached the main shaft, I could hear other miners shouting in panic as they fled their own workings. The emergency bell was ringing somewhere far above, its bronze voice echoing through the interconnected passages in a pattern that meant immediate evacuation. The main shaft was chaos. Dozens of miners crowded the lift platforms, their faces streaked with sweat and grime as they waited for the slow journey to the surface. Some had abandoned their tools in their haste to escape, while others clutched pickaxes and hammers, as if familiar weight might provide comfort in the face of the unknown. The foremen were trying to maintain order, but their voices were nearly drowned by the growing rumble that seemed to come from the mountain's heart itself. I squeezed onto a platform with 7 other miners, men I had worked alongside for years, but whose faces now seemed strange in the red-tinged light that was beginning to emanate from the deeper tunnels. As we rose through the shaft, I could see that every level was being evacuated, hundreds of workers streaming toward the surface in response to whatever disaster was unfolding in the depths. We emerged into daylight to find the city in uproar. The very stones of Thaurissan seemed to be groaning under some unimaginable stress, and in the distance I could see smoke rising from the direction of the royal palace. The other miners scattered toward their homes, desperate to gather families and possessions before whatever was happening reached its climax. I ran toward my own house, pushing through crowds of panicked citizens who seemed to have no clear destination beyond a desperate need to be elsewhere. The heat was even more oppressive on the surface, and the sky had taken on an unnatural copper hue that hurt to look at directly. Birds fell from the air as if poisoned, and the very ground beneath my feet felt unstable, trembling with seismic forces that spoke of changes too vast for the human mind to fully comprehend. Mira was waiting in our doorway, her face pale with terror as she clutched a bag containing our most precious possessions. She had felt the tremors and seen the signs, and her instincts told her we needed to flee immediately. We joined the stream of refugees heading away from the city center, but even as we ran, I could not resist looking back toward the royal palace, where I knew our king was attempting to reshape the very foundations of reality. The palace erupted in a pillar of fire that reached toward the heavens like a burning spear thrust through the world's heart. The light was so brilliant that it seared after-images into my vision, and the heat that followed was like standing too close to a forge fire that had somehow grown to encompass the entire sky. The sound was indescribable, not just noise, but a fundamental vibration that seemed to shake loose every stone in the mountain and set them ringing like enormous bells. Then came the voice, speaking words in a language that predated mortal civilization, but whose meaning burned itself into every mind within 100 miles. It spoke of dominion and flame, of ancient powers roused from slumber by the desperate prayers of mortals who had no understanding of what they summoned. The air itself caught fire, and the Red Ridge Mountains began to crack like an egg struck by a hammer. The explosion that followed reshaped the landscape in ways that geology textbooks could never adequately describe. Peaks that had stood for millions of years were reduced to rubble in moments, while new mountains thrust themselves from the Earth's bowels with volcanic fury. The valley where Thaurissan had stood became a crater filled with molten rock, and from its center rose a new mountain that pulsed with inner fire like a beating heart made of stone and flame. Ragnaros the Firelord had entered our world, and his presence transformed everything it touched. The refugees who had fled fast enough to escape the initial devastation found themselves witnesses to the birth of what would become known as Blackrock Mountain, a structure that was as much elemental manifestation as geological formation. Those who had not fled far enough simply vanished, their bodies consumed by temperatures that turned stone to liquid and air to plasma. I watched my home die from a hillside 3 miles away, Mira's hand clutched in mine as we stared at the pillar of fire that had replaced everything we had ever known. The heat reached us even at that distance, hot enough to blister exposed skin and make breathing an agony. Other survivors huddled nearby, all of us reduced to the same stunned silence as we tried to process the magnitude of what we had witnessed. When the immediate eruption subsided, leaving behind a smoking mountain that glowed like a coal in a blacksmith's forge, we thought the worst was over. Some talked of rebuilding elsewhere, of using our mining skills to establish new communities in more stable regions. We had no understanding then of the true nature of what our king had unleashed, no conception of the price that would be demanded for his desperate gamble. The compulsion came gradually at first, a whisper in the back of the mind that suggested returning to investigate the ruins might be worthwhile. Perhaps some of our possessions could be salvaged, or maybe other survivors needed rescue from the wreckage. The thoughts seemed reasonable, even noble, and many of us found ourselves walking back toward the new mountain, despite every rational instinct screaming that we should flee as far as possible. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The Firelord's will had taken root in our minds, growing stronger with each step toward his domain, until resistance became impossible. We were being called home, drawn back to serve in the depths of the mountain that had become his fortress and our tomb. Those few who had fled far enough to escape the initial summoning were spared this fate, but those of us who had lingered to witness the destruction found ourselves caught in a web of supernatural compulsion that transformed loyal subjects into willing slaves. The first descent into the new mountain was like walking into the throat of a living furnace. The passages had been carved not by tools but by the Firelord's will, creating tunnels that followed no mortal logic, but served the needs of an entity whose thoughts moved along entirely alien paths. Fire elementals waited to guide us deeper, their forms shifting between solid matter and pure flame, as they herded us toward our assigned roles in the vast mining operation that would feed their master's power. I found myself assigned to a crew tasked with extracting the exotic materials that could only be formed under the extreme conditions present in the mountain's heart. My pickaxe, the same tool my father had carried and his father before him, now served a new master whose hunger for certain minerals was as endless as his capacity for destruction. The familiar weight felt strange in my hands, as if the tool itself had been transformed by exposure to forces that operated outside natural law. The other members of my crew were dark iron dwarves I had known for years, miners and craftsmen whose skills had once served our king's ambitions for a new kingdom. Now we worked side by side in conditions that would have killed us within minutes under normal circumstances. Our bodies somehow adapted to function in temperatures that turned metal soft and made the very air shimmer with heat distortion. We did not speak much during those early days, partly because the heat made conversation difficult, but mostly because we were all struggling to understand what we had become. We were still ourselves in most ways, retaining our memories and personalities, but overlaying everything was an absolute compulsion to serve the Firelord's needs. Resistance was not just futile, but literally unthinkable, as if the very concept of disobedience had been burned out of our minds along with any hope of escape. The work was unlike anything we had done in our previous lives as miners. Instead of carefully following natural veins of ore, we excavated according to patterns that served magical rather than geological purposes. The materials we extracted were often substances that had no names in any mortal language, crystals that formed only under specific combinations of heat and pressure that existed nowhere else in the known world. As weeks turned to months, we began to notice changes in ourselves beyond the obvious adaptations that allowed us to survive in the mountain's depths. Our skin took on a grayish cast, our eyes began to glow with inner fire, and our voices developed a rasp that spoke of damage from breathing superheated air day after day. More disturbing was the way our thoughts began to change, becoming more focused on the immediate requirements of our work and less concerned with the broader questions of our fate. The Firelord's influence was slowly burning away everything that made us individuals, leaving behind only the essential skills needed for our function as miners and the absolute loyalty that ensured we would never rebel against our conditions. We were becoming extensions of his will, organic tools that could think just enough to perform complex tasks, but not enough to question the purpose of their existence. In the brief moments when the compulsion seemed to loosen its grip, usually during the periods of rest we were allowed between shifts, I tried to hold on to memories of my life before the mountain. I thought of Mira, hoping she had escaped the summoning's influence and found safety somewhere beyond the Firelord's reach. I remembered the satisfaction of honest work, the pride of craftsmanship, the simple pleasure of returning home to a warm meal and a loving smile. But these memories grew fainter with each passing day, their emotional resonance diminished by the constant presence of the alien will that had taken up residence in my mind. I could recall the facts of my previous life, but they felt increasingly like stories I had heard about someone else, rather than experiences I had lived myself. The mountain was becoming my entire world, its flaming passages the only reality that seemed to matter. And so began my service in the depths of Blackrock Mountain, where I would spend the next 4 decades learning that there are indeed fates worse than death, and that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not the ending of a life, but its continuation under circumstances that strip away everything that made it worth living. A typical shift in the molten core begins before dawn. Though the distinction between day and night holds little meaning in the depths, where eternal fire casts the only light we know. The summoning bell tolls through the tunnels with a sound like grinding metal, its bronze voice corrupted by the extreme heat until it resembles the death rattle of some enormous beast. We rise from our sleeping alcoves, carved into cooled lava tubes that provide the only refuge from the constant furnace heat of the main passages. Sleep, when it comes at all, is a fitful thing haunted by dreams of surface winds and cool rain that our minds conjure from memories growing fainter with each passing year. I have learned to sleep with a damp cloth over my face, wrung out in the brackish water that seeps through certain rock formations. But even this small comfort evaporates within minutes of contact with the superheated air. My sleeping space is a niche barely large enough for a single dwarf, its walls scarred by the claws of previous occupants who scratched desperate messages into the stone before madness or death claimed them. The journey to our assigned work areas takes us deeper into the mountain's heart, following passages that glow with their own inner light from veins of molten rock visible through cracks in the tunnel walls. Our feet have grown thick calluses that allow us to walk on stone hot enough to brand flesh. But even so, we must be careful where we step. Pools of lava bubble up from fissures in the floor without warning, and more than one miner has vanished into these impromptu furnaces when exhaustion made them careless. Fire elementals patrol these passages like walking incarnations of the mountain's wrath. They tower above us, their forms shifting between solid magma and pure flame as they oversee our procession toward the work sites. When they speak, which is rarely, their voices sound like the roar of forge fires fed by hurricane winds. Most communication with these overseers happens through gestures and the universal language of quota fulfillment. They care nothing for our individual struggles or the toll the work takes on our bodies. We are tools to them, no different from pickaxes or hauling carts, valued only for our ability to extract the materials their master requires. The mining face where my crew works lies in a vast chamber carved from obsidian and cooled lava, its ceiling lost in shadows that dance with reflected firelight. The walls here pulse with veins of exotic minerals that exist nowhere else in the natural world, crystalline formations that grow only under the specific conditions created by the Firelord's presence. Our task is to extract these materials without damaging their delicate structure, a requirement that makes the work both technically demanding and physically exhausting. My pickaxe, inherited from my father and his father before him, has been transformed by decades of use in these conditions. The metal head glows with constant heat, never cooling enough to touch with bare skin, while the wooden handle has been replaced multiple times with materials that can withstand the temperature extremes. The tool feels different in my hands now, heavier somehow, as if it too has absorbed some of the mountain's alien essence and become something other than what it was designed to be. The quotas we must meet are calculated by minds that operate according to inhuman logic. Each crew is assigned a specific tonnage of material to extract during every 12-hour shift, with the understanding that failure means immediate incineration by our elemental overseers. These quotas seem to increase gradually over time, as if the Firelord's appetite for certain substances grows with each passing year. What once seemed merely difficult has become nearly impossible, pushing us to work at a pace that would have killed us within days during our previous lives as surface miners. The obsidian we extract comes in several varieties, each with properties that serve different aspects of the Firelord's incomprehensible projects. The most common type appears as black glass, shot through with veins of red fire, beautiful to look at but treacherous to work with, since it shatters unpredictably under the stress of excavation. More valuable is the variety that maintains its heat indefinitely, glowing like coals that never burn out, and feeling warm to the touch even after being removed from the mountain's depths. But it is the fire crystals that our overseers prize most highly, formations that grow in clusters like frozen flame and pulse with their own internal light. These crystals form only in areas where the boundary between the elemental plane of fire and our own reality has worn thin, creating conditions that allow pure magical energy to crystallize into solid form. Extracting them requires delicate work with specialized tools, since any impact that cracks their structure causes them to explode with the force of concentrated flame. The sulfur deposits provide another major component of our daily harvest, though this material comes with its own unique hazards. The gas pockets that form around sulfur veins can kill a miner in seconds if disturbed improperly, filling his lungs with poison that burns from the inside out. We have learned to recognize the warning signs of gas accumulation, the subtle changes in air pressure, and the faint hissing sounds that precede a deadly release. But even experienced miners sometimes fall victim to pockets that give no advance warning. Working in these conditions takes a toll on the body that would be impossible to survive without the supernatural changes that slavery to the Firelord has wrought in our flesh. Our lungs have adapted to process air so hot it would sear the throat of any surface dweller, while our skin has developed a resistance to heat that allows us to work with materials that glow like forged coals. These adaptations come at a cost, however, as they mark us as something no longer entirely dwarven, beings transformed by elemental forces into creatures that exist between the natural and supernatural worlds. The physical changes are obvious to anyone who looks closely at the miners who have served longest in the depths. Our skin takes on a grayish pallor, shot through with veins of orange fire that pulse in rhythm with our heartbeats. Our eyes glow with inner flame, providing natural illumination in the darkest tunnels, but marking us forever as servants of the Firelord. Most disturbing of all is the way our hair begins to smolder at the roots, never quite catching fire but always on the verge of combustion, filling the air around us with the acrid smell of singed keratin. The food we consume bears little resemblance to the hearty meals I remember from my previous life. Mushrooms grow in the volcanic soil near cooling lava flows, their flesh tough and bitter with minerals absorbed from ground that has never known natural sunlight. These fungi provide most of our nutrition, supplemented by occasional distributions of dried meat from creatures that somehow survive in the mountain's hostile environment. The water we drink tastes perpetually of ash and sulfur, drawn from underground springs that bubble up through layers of volcanic rock. Mealtimes are brief affairs conducted in chambers carved from cooled lava tubes, spaces barely large enough to accommodate the miners assigned to each work crew. We eat in silence mostly, our throats too damaged by constant exposure to superheated air to make conversation comfortable. The act of eating itself has become mechanical, a necessity for maintaining the strength required for our work rather than any source of pleasure or social connection. The hierarchy among the miners follows patterns established through decades of brutal selection. Those who have survived longest in the depths become crew leaders, their seniority marked by the extent of their physical transformation and their ability to navigate the complex requirements of different extraction projects. These veterans know which tunnels are safest to traverse, which mineral formations are most likely to yield the required quotas, and how to avoid attracting the hostile attention of our elemental overseers. New miners arrive periodically, usually dark iron dwarves captured during surface raids or drawn to the mountain by the same compulsion that originally claimed us. These newcomers are easy to identify by their relatively normal appearance and their tendency to ask questions that mark them as not yet fully adapted to their circumstances. Watching them undergo the transformation that awaits all who serve in the depths provides a constant reminder of what we ourselves have lost and continue to lose with each passing year. Some break quickly under the conditions, their minds snapping like over-tensioned cables when confronted with the reality of their situation. These unfortunates either throw themselves into the lava flows that run through every major passage, or simply stop eating and drinking until their bodies shut down from malnutrition. Others develop a different kind of madness, becoming obsessed with their work to the exclusion of all other thoughts, mining with mechanical precision, while their personalities slowly dissolve into pure function. The gradual erosion of our culture and traditions represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of our captivity. The songs we once sang while working have been forgotten, their melodies lost to throats damaged by breathing superheated air. The craft techniques passed down through generations of dark iron smiths and miners become irrelevant when applied to materials that exist only in this supernatural environment. Even our language begins to change, incorporating terms borrowed from the fire elementals for concepts that have no equivalent in any mortal tongue. I try to remember my wife's face during the brief rest periods between shifts, but the memory grows fainter with each attempt to summon it. I know she had dark hair and kind eyes, that she laughed easily and worried about my safety in the mines, but the specific details that once made her real to me have been burned away by years of exposure to forces that operate outside normal experience. Sometimes I wonder if she escaped the initial disaster, if she found safety in some distant land where the Firelord's influence cannot reach. But these thoughts bring more pain than comfort. The other miners in my crew have their own ghosts, memories of families and friends left behind when the mountain claimed us. Borin Ironforge speaks sometimes of a son who would be grown now, wondering what kind of man he became without a father's guidance. Dane Blackforge carries a small hammer that belonged to his father, its surface worn smooth by decades of nervous handling during rest periods. These tokens of our previous lives serve as anchors to identities that grow more tenuous with each passing year. Occasionally, during the deepest part of our sleep cycles, when exhaustion overwhelms the compulsions that normally govern our thoughts, we experience moments of clarity that reveal the full horror of our situation. In these brief interludes, we remember what it felt like to choose our own actions, to work toward goals we had selected for ourselves, to feel emotions beyond the narrow range of responses that serve our current function. These moments of awareness are gifts and curses simultaneously, providing glimpses of what we have lost while emphasizing how completely we have been transformed. The work itself follows patterns that have become as automatic as breathing. We wake, descend to our assigned areas, extract the required materials, return to our rest spaces, and sleep until the cycle begins again. Days blend into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years with no variation beyond the gradual increase in quotas and the occasional arrival of new miners to replace those who have finally found escape through madness or death. The camaraderie that develops among long-term survivors represents one of the few human elements that persist in this hellish environment. Without words, we share techniques for managing the heat and gas hazards, warn each other of unstable rock formations, and provide what comfort we can during the moments when the weight of our circumstances becomes unbearable. These connections form slowly and carefully, since displays of emotion that might be interpreted as resistance to our function could attract unwanted attention from our overseers. Borin and I have worked side by side for over 30 years now, long enough to develop a communication system based on subtle gestures and changes in working rhythm. When he grows careless due to exhaustion, I find ways to alert him to dangers without appearing to interfere with his individual productivity. When my own strength flags during particularly demanding extractions, he adjusts his own pace to help meet our combined quotas. These small acts of mutual support provide the only warmth to be found in an environment designed to burn away everything that makes us individuals. The knowledge that escape is impossible has become so fundamental to our existence that we rarely even think about it anymore. The compulsion that brought us here ensures that leaving is literally unthinkable, while the physical changes we have undergone would make survival on the surface impossible, even if we could somehow overcome the mental barriers. We are creatures of this mountain now, as adapted to its hostile environment as the fire elementals that oversee our work, but without their immunity to the psychological toll of eternal servitude. As the years pass, I find myself changing in ways that go beyond the obvious physical adaptations. My thoughts become more focused on the immediate requirements of the work, less concerned with questions about the purpose or morality of what we are doing. The part of my mind that once planned for the future or reflected on the past grows smaller and quieter, overwhelmed by the constant need to meet quotas and avoid the attention of our overseers. I am becoming a more efficient tool, but at the cost of everything that once made me Thorek Ironpick, rather than simply another mining implement in the Firelord's arsenal. The first sign that our isolated existence in the mountain's depths was about to change came not through the usual channels of fire elemental communication, but through vibrations in the stone itself. After 15 years of slavery to the Firelord, we had grown sensitive to every tremor and shift in the mountain structure, able to distinguish between the natural settling of cooling lava and the more ominous sounds that indicated structural damage or new excavations. These new vibrations were different, rhythmic and purposeful in a way that spoke of organized construction rather than geological processes. The fire elementals that oversaw our work crews began exhibiting unusual behavior, their forms flickering with agitation as they received communications from higher powers within their alien hierarchy. For creatures that normally moved with the slow certainty of living flame, their sudden urgency was unsettling. They drove us harder than usual during the shifts that followed, demanding increased quotas of exotic materials whose purpose we had never understood, but which clearly served some urgent need in the conflicts brewing above our heads. It was Borin who first spotted the strangers descending through passages that had been sealed since the mountain's creation. We were working a particularly rich vein of fire crystals in one of the deeper chambers when movement in the shadows caught his attention. At first, we thought it might be a new variety of fire elemental, since the figures moved with the confident stride of beings who belonged in this hostile environment. But as they drew closer, we could see that they were flesh and blood creatures like ourselves, though of a species we had never encountered during our surface lives. The orcs were massive beings, their green skin marked with ritual scars, and their tusks gleaming in the light of our work lamps. They wore armor that had been adapted for the mountain's extreme temperatures, metal plates backed with some kind of insulation that allowed them to function in conditions that would have killed unprotected visitors within minutes. Their leader, a scarred veteran whose presence commanded immediate respect, even from our fire elemental overseers, surveyed our work area with the calculating gaze of someone assessing valuable resources. For a brief moment, hope flared in my chest like a coal touched by sudden wind. These were outsiders, beings from the surface world who had somehow penetrated the defenses that kept us trapped in our underground prison. Perhaps they were liberators, members of some alliance come to rescue the survivors of Thaurissan's folly, and return us to the lands of the living. The thought was so intoxicating that I nearly forgot to maintain the mechanical rhythm of my pickaxe, only remembering myself when Borin shot me a warning glance. But as we watched the interactions between the orcs and our elemental overseers, it became clear that these newcomers were not here as rescuers. They moved through our work areas with the casual authority of conquerors claiming their prize, pointing at specific mineral deposits and discussing extraction rates in voices that carried easily through the superheated air. The fire elementals, rather than treating them as intruders, seemed to be providing information about our capabilities and the various materials we could produce. The negotiations, conducted in a mixture of languages that included recognizable common and the harsh consonants of what I would later learn was Orcish, resulted in new assignments for many of our crews. Instead of focusing exclusively on the exotic materials that fed the Firelord's power, we were now required to extract more conventional ores suitable for weapon and armor production. Iron deposits that we had previously ignored became priority targets, along with coal seams that could fuel surface forges and the sulfur compounds needed for explosive devices. The orcs established their own hierarchy within the mountain, building fortifications in the upper chambers that commanded the main passages, while leaving the deepest areas under fire elemental control. This arrangement created a complex web of authority that we miners had to navigate carefully, since the requirements of our new masters sometimes conflicted with the quotas demanded by our original captors. Failure to meet either set of expectations could result in punishment ranging from reduced rations to immediate execution. Their leader, who carried himself with the bearing of a seasoned military commander, took personal interest in optimizing our operations for their war effort. He spoke with the senior fire elementals through intermediaries who possessed some kind of translation magic, negotiating agreements that treated us as industrial assets to be shared, rather than sentient beings with any rights or desires of our own. The casual efficiency with which he reorganized our lives demonstrated a thorough understanding of slave labor management that spoke of extensive experience with such arrangements. The establishment of what they called Blackrock Spire above our heads brought dramatic changes to the mountain's internal structure. The orcs carved new passages connecting the surface installations to our mining areas, creating transportation routes that allowed for rapid movement of both personnel and extracted materials. The constant traffic of orc warriors, human prisoners, and goblin technicians through previously isolated sections of the mountain made our work environment significantly more dangerous. These new passages also brought different varieties of danger that we had to learn to recognize and avoid. Orc warriors were notoriously quick to violence when frustrated or threatened, and their definition of threatening behavior included anything that might be interpreted as slowing down production or showing insufficient deference to their authority. Unlike the fire elementals, whose alien nature made their reactions somewhat predictable, the orcs possessed a volatile temperament that could explode into lethal violence without warning. The weapon forges they established in chambers above the main mining areas created additional demands for specific types of raw materials. Iron ore had to be extracted with particular attention to purity levels, since inferior metal would result in weapons that failed under stress. Coal requirements increased dramatically as they sought to maintain the high temperatures needed for advanced metallurgy. Most challenging of all was their demand for the rare minerals that could be worked into enchanted weapons, substances that required extremely delicate extraction techniques to preserve their magical properties. Working conditions deteriorated as the mountain filled with competing factions, each pursuing their own agenda while caring nothing for the welfare of the miners who made their plans possible. The fire elementals became more demanding as they found their absolute authority challenged by the presence of surface dwellers who possessed their own military power. The orcs, meanwhile, showed no patience for the supernatural constraints that governed our behavior, expecting us to simply ignore the compulsions that made resistance to the Firelord literally impossible. It was during this period of increasing tension that the Black Dragon arrived, though we initially had no understanding of what he truly was. The first sign of his presence was a change in the behavior of both orcs and fire elementals, a new caution in their movements that suggested the arrival of something powerful enough to command respect from all existing factions. The temperature fluctuations in certain sections of the mountain became more extreme, alternating between the familiar furnace heat of the fire elemental domains and an unnatural chill that seemed to drain warmth from both air and stone. Nefarian announced his presence through a series of architectural modifications that demonstrated power on a scale we had never witnessed, even during the Firelord's initial summoning. Entire chambers were reshaped overnight, their walls flowing like liquid stone before hardening into new configurations that served purposes we could not fathom. The passages connecting different levels of the mountain began following routes that defied conventional geometry, creating shortcuts that allowed movement between distant areas in impossibly short periods of time. The experiments began subtly, with individual miners disappearing from their assigned crews without explanation. At first, we assumed these disappearances followed the familiar pattern of exhaustion, accident, or suicide that had claimed so many of our number over the years. But the bodies never appeared in the usual locations, and the missing miners included veterans whose experience and adaptation to the mountain's conditions made sudden death unlikely. The truth became apparent when one of the missing miners returned to our work area, transformed into something that retained enough of his original appearance to be recognizable while incorporating elements that belonged to no natural creature. Corin Blackforge had been a steady worker and reliable crew member for over 20 years, his expertise with sulfur extraction making him valuable enough that his disappearance had been noticed immediately. What returned wearing his face possessed the same memories and basic personality, but his flesh had been altered in ways that marked him as belonging to some new category of being. Scales the color of dried blood had replaced patches of his skin, while his eyes now glowed with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the adaptations we had all undergone as servants of the Firelord. His strength had increased dramatically, allowing him to carry loads that would have required 3 normal miners. But this came at the cost of coordination and fine motor control that made delicate extraction work impossible. Most disturbing of all were the moments when his personality seemed to flicker, revealing glimpses of an alien intelligence that looked out through his eyes with cold calculation. The pattern of disappearances accelerated as Nefarian's experiments expanded in scope and ambition. Miners with specific skills or unusual physical characteristics became priority targets for collection, taken without warning from their work sites, and returned days or weeks later bearing modifications that served the dragon's incomprehensible research goals. Some came back with enhanced resistance to heat and toxins, others with altered bone structure that allowed them to access previously unreachable mineral deposits, and a few with mental modifications that made them ideal supervisors for their unaltered colleagues. I avoided selection for these experiments through a combination of careful positioning within my work crew and the kind of luck that becomes increasingly precious as the stakes grow higher. The key was maintaining exactly the right level of productivity to appear valuable enough to preserve but not distinctive enough to attract scientific interest. This required a delicate balancing act that involved suppressing any display of the specialized knowledge that had made me effective during my years as a free miner. The dragon's presence created a 3-way power struggle that turned the mountain into a constant battlefield of competing interests. The fire elementals retained control over the deepest chambers where the most exotic materials were found, but their influence diminished in areas where Nefarian's modifications had altered the fundamental nature of the stone itself. The orcs maintained their military dominance in the middle levels where conventional mining operations continued, but found themselves outmatched when conflicts moved into areas where supernatural forces held sway. We miners learned to exploit these jurisdictional ambiguities for our own survival, developing an informal intelligence network that tracked the movements and priorities of all three factions. Information about planned experiments, shifting quotas, or territorial disputes was shared through subtle signals that would not attract attention from any of our various overseers. Knowledge of which tunnels were currently under dispute allowed us to avoid areas where violence was likely to erupt without warning. The arrival of adventurers from the surface world introduced yet another variable into an already complex situation. These heroes, drawn by tales of treasure and glory hidden within the mountain's depths, began launching raids that targeted all three factions without regard for the political arrangements that governed our daily existence. Their presence created opportunities for brief respite when our overseers were distracted by combat, but also increased dangers as desperate enemies sought to use miners as hostages or human shields. Watching these battles from our hiding places in the mining tunnels provided a unique perspective on conflicts that would later become legendary among surface dwellers. We saw fire elementals fall to the coordinated magic of adventuring parties, their forms dissipating into harmless flame as the spells that bound them to the material plane were disrupted. We witnessed orc warriors making desperate last stands against overwhelming odds, their tactical skill and individual courage ultimately proving insufficient against opponents who possessed both superior equipment and supernatural advantages. The death of Ragnaros himself, when it finally occurred, sent shockwaves through every level of the mountain's hierarchy. The fire elementals that had overseen our work for decades began flickering and fading as the power that sustained their presence in our reality was severed. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the compulsions that bound us to our roles might fade along with our supernatural masters, potentially offering the first real hope of escape we had experienced since our initial enslavement. But the vacuum left by the Firelord's banishment was quickly filled by other powers seeking to claim the mountain's resources for their own purposes. Nefarian's influence expanded rapidly into areas previously controlled by fire elementals, while the orc forces consolidated their hold on strategic positions that commanded the main passages. The brief interregnum of confusion ended with our chains simply being transferred to new masters who proved no more inclined toward mercy than their predecessors. The wars that raged above our heads created a constant state of uncertainty that made even basic survival more challenging than it had been during the stable decades of pure fire elemental rule. Supply lines for food and equipment were frequently disrupted by combat, forcing us to stretch already meager rations and make do with damaged tools. The vibrations from magical battles occasionally destabilized tunnels that had been safely navigable for years, creating new hazards that had to be learned through bitter experience. Most disturbing was the way these conflicts began affecting the mountain's fundamental structure, as the various factions pursued magical techniques that altered the very nature of stone and flame. Passages that had followed logical routes suddenly opened onto chambers that violated basic principles of geometry. Mineral deposits that had remained stable for decades began shifting and changing as reality itself became more fluid under the influence of competing supernatural forces. Through it all, we continued the work that had defined our existence for over 30 years, adapting to new masters and modified quotas while maintaining the mechanical rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. The mountain might change hands repeatedly, its politics might shift like wind-blown sand, but the need for skilled miners remained constant across all regimes. We had become so thoroughly integrated into the infrastructure of this hellish place that no faction could afford to simply eliminate us, regardless of how little they valued our individual lives. As the conflicts intensified and the parade of new masters continued, I began to understand that we had become something more than simple prisoners or slaves. We were an essential component of the mountain itself, as much a part of its structure as the tunnels we had carved or the materials we extracted. Our knowledge of the deep passages, our ability to work with supernatural substances, and our adaptation to conditions that would kill normal surface dwellers made us valuable beyond our simple labor. We had achieved a form of immortality through indispensability, though it was an immortality that offered no joy and promised no end to our suffering. The first adventurers to penetrate the depths of Blackrock Mountain arrived like a fever dream, born from memories of the surface world we had almost forgotten. After 35 years of slavery to inhuman masters, the sight of beings who moved with the purposeful stride of free creatures was so alien that we initially mistook them for some new variety of elemental manifestation. They descended through passages that had been sealed since the mountain's creation, their armor gleaming with enchantments that protected them from the crushing heat and toxic atmosphere that had become our natural environment. I was working a particularly challenging seam of fire crystals in the lower chambers when the sounds of combat first echoed through the tunnels above our heads. The clash of steel against stone, the distinctive crack of magical energies being unleashed, and voices raised in battle cries that spoke languages I had not heard in decades. These were not the guttural commands of orc overseers or the alien harmonics of fire elemental communication, but the clear tones of human speech mixed with the deeper registers of dwarven war chants. The fire elementals that supervised our work crew began flickering with obvious agitation, their forms shifting between states of matter as they received urgent communications from their superiors in the mountain's hierarchy. For beings that normally moved with the slow certainty of geological processes, their sudden urgency was profoundly unsettling. They drove us harder than usual during the shifts that followed, demanding quotas that seemed designed more to keep us occupied and out of sight than to serve any practical purpose in their usual operations. It was Dane Blackforge who first brought word of what was happening in the upper levels, his face streaked with excitement and terror in equal measure as he returned from a supply run to the intermediate storage chambers. He had witnessed a group of 5 heroes cutting through orc defenders like farmers harvesting wheat, their coordination and equipment marking them as veterans of countless battles against forces that would have overwhelmed any normal military unit. The group consisted of 2 humans whose armor bore the heraldry of Stormwind, a night elf whose movements suggested mastery of arcane forces, a dwarf whose hammer crackled with divine energy, and a gnome whose mechanical devices sparked with engineering brilliance. They moved through the mountain's defenses with the casual efficiency of professionals who had turned monster hunting into a refined art form, dispatching enemies with techniques that demonstrated both individual skill and flawless teamwork. What struck Dane most forcefully was not their prowess in combat, impressive though it was, but the way they carried themselves. These were beings who had never known servitude, who moved through the world making choices based on their own desires and objectives, rather than the compulsions imposed by supernatural masters. The contrast with our own condition was so stark that it hurt to contemplate, like staring directly into sunlight after spending decades in underground darkness. The battles that followed shook the mountain to its foundations, sending vibrations through the deep tunnels that spoke of massive destruction occurring in areas we had never been permitted to access. The Shadowforge city, carved into the mountain's heart by generations of dark iron craftsmen, became a battleground where our enslaved kinsmen fought desperately against liberators they had been conditioned to see as enemies. The irony was lost on none of us who understood the true nature of our situation, but the compulsions that governed our behavior made any expression of this awareness impossible. Emperor King Thaurissan, descendant of the fool whose summoning had doomed us all, made his final stand in the throne room that had been built above the ruins of the original city. The battle that determined his fate lasted for hours, its echoes reaching us even in the deepest mining chambers, as stone cracked and magical energies discharged with enough force to temporarily disrupt the mountain's fundamental structure. When the sounds finally ceased, followed by the distinctive silence that marks the death of someone whose power had shaped the lives of thousands, we knew that another era in our endless captivity had come to an end. The death of the Emperor created a power vacuum that threw the entire Dark Iron hierarchy into chaos. Without central authority to coordinate their activities, the various factions that had maintained order in the underground city began fighting among themselves for control of key installations. Fire elementals found their authority challenged by Dark Iron nobles who no longer feared imperial retribution, while goblin technicians switched allegiances based on whoever could offer the most immediate protection from the violence spreading through every level of the mountain. For miners like ourselves, caught between competing factions and lacking any protection beyond our value as skilled laborers, this period of political instability proved more dangerous than the most hazardous mining operations. Rival groups would capture work crews and force them to extract materials that served immediate tactical needs rather than long-term production goals. The quotas that had provided structure to our existence for decades dissolved into a chaotic series of emergency demands that changed daily based on whoever happened to control our particular section of the tunnel network. It was during this chaos that the first successful escape occurred, an event so unprecedented that it took several days for the remaining miners to fully comprehend what had happened. Thorin Coalbeard, a veteran who had survived 40 years in the depths through a combination of skill and extraordinary luck, simply vanished from his assigned workstation without any trace of death or capture. The guards who discovered his absence found his tools laid out with uncharacteristic care, as if he had completed some final task before walking away from the only life he had known since the mountain's creation. The implications of Thorin's disappearance rippled through our underground community like seismic shocks. If one of us could escape, others might follow, potentially ending decades of captivity that we had accepted as immutable fact. But the hope this realization inspired was tempered by the knowledge that escape attempts which failed would result in punishments severe enough to make our current suffering seem pleasant by comparison. The few who attempted to follow Thorin's path were captured within hours and subjected to modifications that left them as warning examples of the price of rebellion. Meanwhile, the adventurers who had penetrated the upper levels continued their methodical assault on the mountain's defenses, working their way deeper toward the core where Ragnaros himself maintained his primary manifestation in the material plane. Their progress could be tracked by the increasingly desperate measures employed by our fire elemental overseers, who began demanding materials for weapons and defenses with specifications that suggested preparation for a siege that would determine the fate of their entire presence in our reality. The requisitions for exotic substances reached levels that would have been impossible to meet under normal circumstances, forcing us to work shifts that lasted 20 hours out of every 24 and to extract materials from deposits so dangerous that survival rates dropped to levels not seen since the earliest years of our enslavement. Fire crystals that normally required delicate handling were torn from their matrix with desperate haste, while sulfur compounds were processed in quantities that filled entire chambers with toxic fumes that seared the lungs even of miners whose bodies had adapted to survive in the mountain's hostile environment. The invasion of the molten core itself began on a day when the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation of approaching violence. We had been evacuated from the deepest chambers and herded into intermediate holding areas where fire elementals could maintain better control over our movements while still keeping us available for emergency extraction work. From these positions, we could hear the sounds of battle echoing through passages that had been carved from cooling lava during the mountain's creation. The clash of weapons against elemental forces, accompanied by incantations in languages that predated the rise of mortal civilization. The adventurers who dared to challenge Ragnaros in his own domain possessed equipment and abilities that placed them on a level approaching that of the legendary heroes whose deeds had shaped the early history of our people. Their weapons blazed with enchantments designed specifically to harm beings of pure elemental force, while their protective spells created barriers that could withstand temperatures capable of melting conventional armor within seconds. Most importantly, they moved with the confidence of warriors who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious through skill, preparation, and the kind of teamwork that could only develop among those who trusted each other with their lives. The final confrontation between these heroes and the Firelord himself generated forces that reshaped portions of the mountain's internal structure, creating new passages while sealing others under flows of molten rock that would take decades to cool sufficiently for safe passage. From our hiding places in the mining tunnels, we felt the mountain convulse as powers that had shaped the elemental planes clashed with mortal determination, backed by divine blessing and arcane mastery. When Ragnaros fell, banished back to the elemental plane that had spawned him, the silence that followed was unlike anything we had experienced since our enslavement began. The constant background hum of supernatural compulsion that had governed our thoughts and actions for over 3 decades simply ceased, leaving us alone with our own minds for the first time in longer than some of us could clearly remember. The sensation was so disorienting that several miners collapsed from the shock of suddenly regaining conscious control over their own decisions. The period that followed the Firelord's defeat represented the closest we had come to actual freedom since the mountain's creation. With their supernatural master banished and their elemental hierarchy disrupted, the fire elementals that had overseen our work crews began flickering and fading as the power that sustained their presence in the material plane was severed. Some simply dissolved into harmless flame, while others retreated to deeper chambers where concentrations of residual magical energy might allow them to maintain coherent form for a few more years. Without overseers to enforce quotas or punish disobedience, many miners simply stopped working and began exploring sections of the mountain that had been forbidden to us for decades. We discovered chambers filled with treasures that our labor had helped extract over the years, stockpiles of weapons and armor that bore the craftsmanship of our own people from the time before our enslavement. More importantly, we found passages that led toward the surface, routes that might allow escape from the prison that had contained us for so long. But the taste of freedom proved as ephemeral as morning mist in the face of advancing sunlight. The power vacuum left by Ragnaros's banishment attracted new claimants who possessed their own methods of ensuring compliance from valuable assets like experienced miners. Fire elementals of lesser power but greater cunning emerged from the depths where they had waited for centuries, binding themselves to the mountain structure in ways that made their presence more permanent than their predecessors, while offering new forms of compulsion that proved equally effective at maintaining control over our actions. The brief interregnum of hope ended when the new elemental hierarchy established itself with ruthless efficiency, demonstrating that our expertise remained too valuable to lose regardless of how the political situation evolved. The mining operations resumed under modified management that proved even more demanding than the previous regime, as our new masters sought to rapidly rebuild the stockpiles of exotic materials that had been depleted during the recent conflicts. The establishment of Blackwing Lair in the upper reaches of the mountain introduced yet another layer of complexity to our existence, as Nefarian's experiments required substances that could only be extracted from the deepest and most dangerous sections of the tunnel network. His demand for components that would fuel his research into chromatic dragonflight creation pushed us to work deposits that had been considered too hazardous to approach during even the most desperate periods of our previous servitude. The constant stream of adventurers who began treating the mountain as a training ground for aspiring heroes created an environment of perpetual warfare that made survival increasingly dependent on our ability to predict and avoid the consequences of battles we had no stake in beyond our role as collateral damage. These raids occurred with such regularity that we learned to recognize the warning signs of approaching violence and developed evacuation procedures that could clear vulnerable areas within minutes of detecting the distinctive sounds of heavily armed groups making their way through the upper passages. Watching these legendary battles from our hiding places in the service tunnels provided a unique perspective on conflicts that would later be celebrated in songs and stories throughout the civilized world. We saw heroes whose names would become synonymous with courage and sacrifice, warriors whose individual accomplishments rivaled the great champions of earlier ages. But from our position as unwilling witnesses, these figures appeared more as natural disasters than saviors, forces of destruction whose noble purposes offered no protection to bystanders caught in their path. The psychological toll of witnessing so much death and destruction while remaining powerless to influence its outcome began manifesting in ways that went beyond the obvious physical damage inflicted by our working conditions. Miners who had maintained their sanity through decades of supernatural enslavement began exhibiting signs of breakdown as the cognitive dissonance between hope and reality proved more damaging than simple despair had ever been. The brief taste of freedom we had experienced following Ragnaros's defeat made our return to servitude feel like a fresh wound, rather than the familiar ache of an old injury. As the years continued to pass and the parade of heroes treating our home as their personal battleground showed no signs of ending, I began to develop a detachment from the outside world's conflicts that went beyond mere survival instinct. These struggles between good and evil, alliance and horde, order and chaos, meant nothing to beings whose entire existence had been reduced to the extraction of materials that would fuel whatever faction happened to control our section of the mountain at any given moment. We had become something beyond politics or morality, creatures whose function transcended the temporary concerns of mortal civilization. The growing awareness that we had somehow outlasted multiple regimes while remaining essentially unchanged in our fundamental condition brought with it a kind of peace that was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. We were survivors in the truest sense, beings who had endured conditions that would have destroyed lesser creatures. But our survival had come at the cost of everything that had once made our lives meaningful beyond simple continuation. We were archaeological specimens of our own past, preserved in forms that bore only superficial resemblance to the dwarves we had been before the mountain claimed us. The world ended for the second time in my lifetime on a day when the mountain itself seemed to scream in agony. I had grown accustomed to the familiar rhythm of seismic activity that marked the passage of years in our underground prison, the steady pulse of cooling lava and shifting stone that provided the only calendar we knew. But the tremors that began in what surface dwellers would later call the cataclysm were different, more violent and purposeful, as if some cosmic force had decided that the existing order of reality required fundamental revision. The first sign that something unprecedented was occurring came through changes in the fire elemental hierarchy that had governed our existence for the past several years. These beings, normally as predictable as the geological processes they embodied, began exhibiting behaviors that suggested communication with powers far beyond anything we had previously encountered. Their forms flickered with agitation that went beyond their usual responses to quotas or production schedules, and the harmonic frequencies they used for long-distance communication took on urgency that made the very air around them vibrate with barely contained energy. I was working a particularly challenging vein of obsidian in the deep chambers when the mountain began its transformation. my pickaxe following patterns established through decades of experience with the peculiar requirements of volcanic glass extraction. The obsidian here grew in formations that defied conventional geology, shaped by forces that operated according to magical rather than natural law, creating structures that were both beautiful and treacherous to work with. One careless strike could shatter an entire formation, sending razor-sharp fragments through the air with enough force to embed themselves in tunnel walls. The earthquake that announced Deathwing's return to our world was unlike anything in our collective memory, including those of us who had survived the original summoning of Ragnaros. Where that earlier catastrophe had been focused and purposeful, the reshaping of reality that accompanied the aspect of death's emergence from Deepholm felt chaotic and malevolent, as if the very fabric of existence was being torn apart by claws designed to destroy rather than create. Entire sections of the tunnel network that had remained stable since the mountain's creation suddenly collapsed or transformed into configurations that violated basic principles of structural engineering. Passages that had once run in straight lines now curved through spaces that seemed larger on the inside than their external dimensions could accommodate. Chambers that had been spherical became angular, while others stretched into shapes that hurt to contemplate directly, as if geometry itself had become subject to the whims of a mad deity. The lava flows that had provided consistent heat sources for our work areas began behaving according to new laws that made prediction impossible. Streams of molten rock that had followed the same channels for decades suddenly reversed direction or split into multiple tributaries that carved fresh passages through solid stone. The temperatures fluctuated wildly, creating zones where the air itself became superheated to levels that challenged even our adapted physiology, while other areas experienced sudden cooling that left pools of rapidly solidifying magma-blocking roots we had used for years. Most disturbing of all were the new fissures that opened in response to the geological upheaval, cracks in the mountain's structure that revealed depths we had never suspected existed. Some of these openings released gases that carried scents of places that existed beyond normal reality, while others glowed with light that seemed to come from sources located impossibly far below the mountain's foundation. The fire elementals refused to allow us to investigate these anomalies directly, but their obvious fear of whatever lay beyond those cracks suggested discoveries that would have challenged our understanding of the world's basic structure. The presence of Deathwing himself, though we never saw the dragon aspect directly during this period, could be felt as a constant pressure that made the air thick and difficult to breathe. His malevolent influence permeated every stone of the mountain, transforming it from a prison into something that felt actively hostile to all forms of life. The very walls seemed to pulse with hatred, and more than once I caught myself checking over my shoulder for threats that existed only in the paranoid fantasies that his proximity inspired in mortal minds. It was during the worst of these upheavals that we learned of Nefarian's resurrection, though the news came to us through channels so indirect that the full implications took weeks to become clear. The Black Dragon's return to unlife had been accomplished through methods that defied natural law, binding his consciousness to forms of matter that existed partially outside normal reality. This supernatural resurrection process had changed him in ways that went beyond simple restoration, granting him powers that had not been available during his previous incarnation, while imposing limitations that made him dependent on resources that could only be extracted under the most dangerous conditions. The establishment of Blackwing descent in chambers carved from living rock that still writhed with the trauma of its violent reshaping brought new demands for materials that pushed our extraction capabilities beyond anything we had previously attempted. The dragon's experiments required substances that existed only in the boundary zones where reality became thin, crystalline formations that grew in areas where the barriers between elemental planes had been weakened by the recent catastrophic events. These new mining operations took us into sections of the mountain that had been created during the cataclysm itself, passages that still glowed with residual energy from the forces that had shaped them. Working in these areas required protective equipment that was beyond the technological capabilities of our captors, forcing them to rely on magical wards that provided incomplete protection against radiation that slowly poisoned anyone exposed to it for extended periods. The symptoms began subtly, with fatigue and disorientation that could easily be attributed to the demanding nature of the work itself. But as the weeks passed, those of us assigned to the Elementium extraction teams began exhibiting changes that went far beyond our previous adaptations to the mountain's hostile environment. Our skin took on a metallic sheen that reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, while our hair began falling out in patches that revealed scalp tissue marked with veins of silver and gold. Most disturbing was the way our thoughts seemed to slow and crystallize, becoming more focused on the immediate requirements of our work, while losing the flexibility that had allowed us to adapt to changing circumstances over the decades. The Elementium itself defied every principle of material science that our people had developed through millennia of mining and metallurgy. It existed in a state that was simultaneously solid and liquid, maintaining structural integrity while flowing like water when subjected to forces that should have shattered conventional metals. Extracting it required techniques that had to be developed through trial and error, since none of our traditional methods proved effective with substances that operated according to laws that contradicted basic physics. More than half of the first extraction team died within days of beginning work with Elementium deposits, their bodies unable to process the exotic energies released during the mining process. Those who survived did so by undergoing transformations that left them barely recognizable as the dwarves they had once been, their flesh taking on properties that allowed them to interact safely with materials that would have killed normal mortals through mere proximity. The increased presence of black dragonflight members in our daily operations brought a new variety of terror to existence that had already been reduced to its most basic elements. These creatures possessed intelligence that rivaled that of the greatest scholars while maintaining the predatory instincts of apex predators, making them far more dangerous than the fire elementals whose alien nature at least made their reactions somewhat predictable. A black dragon could decide to incinerate an entire work crew simply because their productivity had declined by a few percentage points. Or they might choose to preserve miners whose skills they found particularly interesting for use in experiments that made death seem like a mercy. Working under their direct supervision required a level of attention to detail that was exhausting to maintain, since any mistake that caught their notice could result in selection for modification procedures that had grown increasingly sophisticated since Nefarian's return. The dragon's research had progressed beyond simple physical alterations to include mental modifications that could rewrite personality and memory, while preserving the technical knowledge that made skilled miners valuable. These enhanced workers displayed efficiency levels that surpassed anything achieved through conventional training, but at the cost of everything that had made them individuals rather than biological machines. The creation of new chromatic experiments using mining crews as test subjects became a regular occurrence that we learned to anticipate and avoid through careful observation of selection patterns. The dragons showed preference for miners who displayed unusual resistance to the various toxins and radiations present in their work environment, viewing such adaptations as promising starting points for further enhancement. Those chosen for these experiments rarely returned in forms that retained enough of their original consciousness to communicate their experiences, though their enhanced capabilities made them valuable assets for the most dangerous extraction operations. Watching our colleagues disappear into the experimental chambers and emerge as creatures that bore only superficial resemblance to their former selves provided constant reminders of our own precarious position in the mountain's hierarchy. We were valuable resources, but resources that could be modified or consumed at will by beings whose purposes remained incomprehensible to mortal minds. The knowledge that our usefulness provided only temporary protection from fates worse than death created a psychological pressure that was in some ways more destructive than the physical hazards of our work environment. The war that Deathwing was waging against the surface world became increasingly evident through the demands placed on our production capabilities. Weapons forged from the materials we extracted were being distributed to armies whose very existence challenged the natural order, while the exotic substances required for his most devastating attacks pushed us to work deposits that had been considered too dangerous to approach even during the most desperate periods of our captivity. The quotas increased weekly, accompanied by threats that made clear the consequences of failure to meet the aspect of death's requirements for his campaign against all life. As months passed, and the scale of destruction occurring beyond the mountain's boundaries became apparent through fragments of information gathered from our draconic overseers, I began to realize that escape from our prison might be meaningless, even if it were possible. The world we remembered from our surface lives was being systematically destroyed by forces that made our own suffering seem insignificant by comparison. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to ash and rubble, while entire regions were transformed into uninhabitable wastelands that would require centuries to recover. The knowledge that there might be no world left to return to, even if we could somehow break free from our supernatural bonds, created a despair that went beyond anything we had experienced during the darkest periods of our enslavement. We had endured decades of suffering sustained by the hope that freedom might eventually be possible, but the prospect of escaping into a reality that had been poisoned beyond recognition challenged the psychological foundations that had allowed us to maintain our sanity. It was during this period of growing hopelessness that the final assault on Blackwing Descent began, bringing with it the last great battle that would determine the fate of Nefarian's experiments and our role in them. The adventurers who dared to challenge the Black Dragon in his own domain possessed equipment and abilities that placed them among the greatest heroes of their age, warriors whose individual accomplishments had already earned them legendary status among surface dwellers. Their invasion of the deep chambers where we had labored for so long provided the first hope we had experienced in months that the cycle of violence and exploitation might finally be broken. The battle that followed reshaped our understanding of what mortal beings could accomplish when armed with sufficient determination and supernatural assistance. We watched from our hiding places as these heroes systematically dismantled defenses that had been designed to repel armies, their coordination and tactical brilliance overwhelming opponents whose individual power should have made victory impossible. The death of Nefarian and Onyxia in their reconstructed forms represented the end of an era that had defined our existence for longer than some of us could clearly remember. But even as we celebrated the destruction of our tormentors, we remained fundamentally unchanged by their passing. The compulsions that bound us to our roles had become so deeply integrated into our nature that freedom felt more like abandonment than liberation. We were creatures shaped by decades of supernatural slavery, adapted to function in conditions that would destroy normal dwarves within hours. The mountain had become our entire world, and we had become extensions of its hostile nature, too transformed to survive in any other environment. The brief calm that followed the dragon's defeat provided time for reflection that revealed the true extent of what our long captivity had cost us. I could no longer remember what it felt like to make choices based on personal desire rather than external compulsion. The face of my wife, which I had struggled to preserve in memory for decades, had faded beyond recognition. Even my own name sometimes felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone who had died long ago in tunnels that no longer existed. I had become more elemental than dwarf, a creature of fire and stone whose heartbeat matched the rhythm of the mountain's geological processes. The pickaxe in my hands had become an extension of my body, as much a part of me as my own limbs. When I struck stone, I could feel the mountain's response in my bones, a communication that transcended language and connected me to forces that operated beyond mortal comprehension. I was still Thorek Ironpick in name and memory, but in every other way that mattered, I had become something else entirely. The portal that brought the Iron Horde to our world opened with a sound like reality itself being torn in half. A crimson gateway that spilled forth warriors from a timeline where different choices had led to darker destinies. From our positions deep within the mountain's heart, we felt the dimensional breach as a vibration that traveled through stone and flesh with equal ease, announcing the arrival of forces that carried the stench of otherworldly iron and conquest in their very essence. The orcs who emerged from this bleeding wound in space bore little resemblance to the crude raiders who had occupied the mountain's upper reaches during our earlier captivity. These were beings forged in the crucibles of a harsher reality, their armor bearing technological innovations that spoke of desperate warfare against enemies whose nature we could not fathom. Their weapons hummed with energies that made the air itself taste of copper and ozone, while their eyes held the calculated fury of soldiers who had learned that mercy was a luxury their world could not afford. The Iron Horde's occupation of Blackrock Spire brought with it demands for materials that pushed our extraction capabilities into realms of impossibility that challenged even our supernatural adaptations. The war machines they constructed required alloys that could only be created from substances found in the deepest parts of the mountain, deposits so close to the planet's molten core that the heat approached levels that could melt stone into component elements. Working in these conditions meant venturing into chambers where the boundary between solid matter and plasma became increasingly academic. Warlord Zaela herself descended into our domain on several occasions, her presence marking her as something more than simply another orc commander seeking to exploit the mountain's resources. She moved through the superheated passages with the confidence of someone who had made personal acquaintance with forces that operated beyond mortal understanding, her scarred flesh bearing modifications that allowed her to function in conditions that would have reduced normal creatures to ash within moments of exposure. The dimensional weapons she was constructing in the upper levels required components that existed only in theoretical frameworks, substances that challenged our understanding of matter itself. Temporal crystals that grew in areas where time flowed at different rates demanded extraction techniques that had to account for the way cause and effect became fluid in their presence. Workers assigned to these deposits aged at varying rates depending on their proximity to the formations, some emerging from shifts having experienced days while only hours had passed for those waiting outside the affected zones. More disturbing still were the requests for materials that seemed designed to tear holes in reality itself. Crystalline formations that existed partially outside normal space and whose removal created voids that had to be carefully sealed to prevent catastrophic decompression of the surrounding area. These extraction operations required precision that went beyond anything we had previously attempted, since even minor mistakes could result in the creation of permanent portals to locations that existed beyond the boundaries of our universe. The constant strain of working with materials that violated fundamental laws of physics began taking its toll on even the most experienced miners in ways that went beyond our previous adaptations to supernatural conditions. Our bodies, already transformed by decades of exposure to elemental forces, began incorporating elements that belonged to no natural classification system. Veins of crystalline matter appeared beneath our skin, pulsing with light that matched the temporal fluctuations of the materials we handled daily. The mountain itself seemed to be dying from the inside as multiple factions stripped away resources that had taken geological ages to form. Passages that had remained stable since the original summoning of Ragnaros began collapsing as supporting structures were removed to feed the endless appetite of war machines and dimensional experiments. The very foundations of our prison were being consumed to fuel conflicts we could barely comprehend, creating a situation where our own survival might become impossible, regardless of political changes in the hierarchy above our heads. It was during this period of increasing desperation that I received assignment to the deepest mining operation ever attempted within the mountain structure, a project that would take us closer to the planet's core than any dwarf had ever ventured while retaining the possibility of survival. The expedition team consisted of 12 miners whose experience and supernatural adaptations made them the only candidates capable of functioning in conditions that existed at the boundary between solid matter and the forces that powered stellar formation. The descent took us through tunnels that had been carved not by tools, but by the mountain's own convulsions during its violent creation. Passages that followed routes dictated by forces that operated according to geological rather than engineering principles. The temperature increased with each level we descended, approaching thresholds that challenged even our modified physiology, while the pressure grew intense enough to compress the air itself into forms that required conscious effort to breathe. At depths that placed us several miles below the chambers where we had spent decades of our captivity, we discovered evidence of powers that predated not only the Firelord's summoning, but possibly the formation of the mountain itself. Ancient crystalline formations grew in patterns that suggested intelligent design rather than natural geological processes, their surfaces covered with markings that resembled language but followed no grammatical structures that mortal minds could decode. These artifacts pulsed with energies that made our supernatural modifications respond in ways that bordered on the painful, as if our transformed bodies were attempting to resonate with forces that existed on frequencies too fundamental for consciousness to process directly. Extended exposure to these formations caused visions that revealed glimpses of epochs when the world had been shaped by entities whose purposes remained incomprehensible to beings constrained by linear time and three-dimensional existence. The mining operation itself required techniques that had to be invented as we worked, since none of our traditional methods proved effective with materials that existed partially outside normal reality. The crystals we were tasked with extracting existed in quantum states that made their precise location uncertain until the moment of observation, forcing us to develop approaches that accounted for the way measurement itself affected the outcome of our efforts. Working at these depths also brought us into contact with geological features that challenged our understanding of the mountain's structure. We discovered chambers that were larger than the space they occupied, areas where the laws of geometry became suggestions rather than absolute constraints. Some passages led to locations that existed at different points in time, allowing glimpses of the mountain as it had been during various periods of its violent history. Most disturbing of all was the growing awareness that our activities were having effects that extended far beyond simple resource extraction. The removal of certain crystalline formations seemed to destabilize fundamental forces that maintained the barrier between our reality and the chaotic energies that existed in the spaces between worlds. Each successful extraction brought us closer to a threshold where continued mining might trigger changes that would affect not just the mountain, but the entire region surrounding it. The final assault on Upper Blackrock Spire began on a day when the mountain seemed to shudder with anticipation of approaching violence. The sounds of battle filtered down through miles of stone and superheated air, reaching us as vibrations that spoke of conflicts involving forces capable of reshaping the physical structure of the installation itself. The Iron Horde's war machines, powered by materials we had risked our lives to extract, turned their weapons against enemies whose determination had carried them through defenses designed to repel entire armies. The battle that determined Zayla's fate lasted for what felt like days, though time itself had become unreliable in the depths where we worked. The dimensional weapons she had constructed created temporal distortions that made the sequence of events difficult to follow, while the exotic energies released during combat occasionally reached levels that temporarily disrupted the fundamental forces holding matter together in coherent forms. When the sounds of warfare finally ceased, replaced by a silence that seemed to echo with the weight of massive destruction, we knew that another chapter in the mountain's violent history had reached its conclusion. The sudden absence of the constant background noise created by war machines and dimensional experiments was so complete that it felt oppressive, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath while waiting to discover what would claim dominion over its resources next. But this time, no new faction emerged to fill the vacuum left by the Iron Horde's defeat. The adventurers who had accomplished this latest liberation departed to pursue conflicts elsewhere, leaving behind only empty chambers and the gradually cooling remains of experimental equipment that had pushed the boundaries of what mortal science could achieve. For the first time since our enslavement began, we found ourselves truly alone in the depths of a mountain that had served as prison and home for over 4 decades. The realization that we were no longer serving any master, supernatural or otherwise, created a crisis of purpose that proved more difficult to navigate than the physical challenges of our most dangerous mining operations. We had become so thoroughly defined by our function as extractors of exotic materials that the absence of quotas and overseers left us uncertain about how to structure our existence. The compulsions that had governed our behavior for decades had faded, along with the powers that had imposed them, but the patterns they had created remained embedded in our consciousness, like scars. Some of the miners simply continued working as if nothing had changed, following routes and schedules that no longer served any purpose beyond the comfort of familiar routine. Others began exploring sections of the mountain that had been forbidden during our captivity, seeking treasures or knowledge that might provide some compensation for the decades of suffering we had endured. A few attempted to reach the surface, though none possessed clear plans for what they would do if they succeeded in escaping an environment that had become their entire world. I found myself drawn toward the deepest chambers where we had discovered those ancient crystalline formations, compelled by questions that had developed during our work with materials that existed beyond normal comprehension. The artifacts we had extracted for the Iron Horde's dimensional weapons represented only a fraction of what lay hidden in the mountain's core, and their removal had revealed passages that led toward discoveries that might explain the true nature of the forces that had shaped our reality. The descent into these unexplored depths felt like a pilgrimage toward answers that might provide meaning for suffering that had otherwise served only the ambitions of entities whose purposes remained alien to mortal understanding. My pickaxe, worn smooth by decades of faithful service, felt comfortable in my hands as I carved my way through stone that had never known the touch of conscious intention. Each strike revealed new layers of mineral formations that spoke of geological processes operating according to laws that transcended conventional physics. The passage I followed led steadily downward, its walls marked with those same incomprehensible symbols that had decorated the ancient crystalline formations. The temperature here was different from the elemental heat that had characterized our normal working environment, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the structure of space itself rather than any conventional energy source. Breathing required conscious effort, not because the air was toxic, but because it contained elements that existed outside the periodic table that governed normal matter. After hours of solitary travel through tunnels that showed no signs of previous habitation, I discovered a chamber that defied every principle of architecture and geology that had guided my understanding of underground structures. The space was vast beyond measurement, its boundaries lost in darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than simply reflecting it. But more importantly, it was clearly natural rather than artificial, a cavity that had formed through processes that predated any conscious intervention in the mountain's development. The walls of this chamber were lined with formations that resembled the crystalline artifacts we had extracted for various factions over the years. But these were obviously older and more complex than anything we had previously encountered. They pulsed with rhythms that matched no heartbeat or mechanical process, creating harmonics that seemed to resonate with fundamental frequencies that governed the behavior of matter and energy on levels too basic for normal consciousness to perceive. At the chamber's center, a natural passage led further downward, its opening marked with symbols that were clearly warnings rather than invitations. The air that rose from this deeper tunnel carried sense of places that existed beyond the boundaries of our reality, while lights that belonged to no known spectrum flickered in its depths like signals from intelligence that operated according to entirely different principles of existence. Standing at the threshold of this unknown passage, I faced the first real choice I had been permitted to make in over 40 years of captivity. I could return to the familiar tunnels where other survivors continued their purposeless mining, maintaining routines that provided the comfort of structure even in the absence of external compulsion. Or I could follow this natural passage into depths that might lead to discoveries that would explain the forces that had shaped my existence, regardless of whether those discoveries proved to be liberation or simply a different form of ending. The pickaxe in my hands had become more than a tool during our decades of slavery. It was a connection to traditions that stretched back through generations of dwarven craftsmen who had found meaning in honest labor and the patient extraction of wealth from stubborn stone. But it was also a symbol of servitude, a reminder of years spent enriching masters who valued us only for our ability to survive in conditions that would kill normal workers within hours. I looked back toward the passages that led to the chambers where I had spent most of my adult life, tunnels that contained the accumulated knowledge and experience of 4 decades spent adapting to conditions that existed nowhere else in the known world. Those depths held the bodies of friends who had not survived the various transformations required for our work, along with artifacts that represented the combined achievements of multiple factions that had claimed dominion over the mountain's resources. The choice between known suffering and unknown possibilities had defined every major transition in my life since the day Thaurissan's folly had doomed our people to supernatural slavery. This time, however, the decision was mine alone to make, free from the compulsions that had governed my actions for so long that conscious choice felt like a skill I had never properly learned. I turned toward the natural passage that led into darkness, carrying only my pickaxe and whatever wisdom decades of surviving the impossible had managed to teach me. Each step took me further from everything that had defined my existence, toward discoveries that might provide answers to questions I had learned to stop asking during the worst years of our captivity. The echo of my footsteps was swallowed by stone that had never known the sound of conscious intention, while ahead of me lay darkness that might conceal escape or simply a different variety of ending. The natural passage led upward through stone that had never known the touch of conscious intention, following routes carved by water and time rather than the desperate urgency of enslaved hands. After what felt like hours of climbing through darkness that gradually lightened into something approaching natural illumination, I emerged into sunlight for the first time in over 4 decades. The brightness was agony, forcing me to shield eyes that had adapted to the dim glow of fire crystals and molten stone until they could slowly adjust to the alien concept of unfiltered daylight. The world that greeted me bore little resemblance to the one I remembered from my youth. Blackened soil stretched toward horizons marked by the skeletal remains of forests that had been consumed by conflicts I had witnessed only as distant vibrations through miles of stone. The sky itself seemed scarred, marked with clouds that moved in patterns suggesting atmospheric damage from forces that operated beyond conventional weather systems. Behind me, Blackrock Mountain continued to smoke and rumble, its peak wreathed in vapors that spoke of fires that would never truly die. Somewhere in those depths, other miners remained trapped by compulsions they might never overcome, continuing their eternal labor in service to masters who had long since fallen to dust. The choice between attempting their rescue and finally claiming the freedom I had discovered felt like the first real decision I had been permitted to make in longer than I could clearly remember. I looked down at my hands, scarred and transformed by decades of handling materials that existed outside natural law, and realized that escape from the mountain was only the beginning of a longer journey toward reclaiming whatever remained of the dwarf I had once been. The echo of countless pickaxes still rang in my ears. The rhythm that had governed my existence for so long, it had become indistinguishable from my own heartbeat. Some prisons, I understood now, are carried within the soul rather than built from stone and flame. Each step away from the mountain was a choice to believe that redemption might still be possible, that the heritage of my people could be recovered from the ashes of what I had become. The sound of my footsteps on natural earth felt strange after decades of walking on stone heated by supernatural fires. But it was a strangeness I welcomed as proof that other worlds still existed beyond the one that had claimed so much of my life.